Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. For the latest of our series of Geneva security debates, this one on the militarisation of space and the private sector's expanding role. Thank you for those of you who are here in person for braving the heat wave that Geneva is experiencing at the moment. And thank you for coming to be with us in person. And also very warm welcome to everyone who is following this online. My name is Simon Cleabury. I'm the Head of Arms Control and Disarmament here at the GCSP. And it's my pleasure, particularly, to be putting on this event today and to be welcoming you. And I will be your moderator today. These Geneva security debates consist of public discussions on current security challenges, bringing together the world's leading thinkers and practitioners in interactive debates. The Geneva security debates inform policymakers here in international Geneva, as well as globally, providing new insights and a better understanding of today's security challenges in order to build a better, more equitable, sustainable and peaceful future, we hope. Today's topic is space security, a subject that has been discussed here in Geneva for many years in the Conference on Disarmament and through several UN General Assembly processes. Today's event will focus on a particular growing aspect of space security, the expanding role of the private sector in the militarization of space, which, in the eyes of many, has become a new security issue rather than just a safety and sustainability issue. The use of space systems to support military activity is, of course, not new, but the new element is that it is increasingly being dominated by the private sector. And the rapid development of mega constellations and other space systems by private companies and by state-backed initiatives is erasing the traditional boundaries between commercial and government space activities. And given their size, these mega constellations are hard to counter and as such could potentially constitute an additional threat vector. These developments throw up several questions, and we've thrown out some guiding questions for our panelists today and for you in the audience. Are private sector assets supporting militaries now legitimate military targets? What are the legal and ethical dimensions of the private sector's involvement in space? In space warfare, and what is the impact of dual-use technologies and privately led programs on strategic stability? And finally, what are the implications for space traffic management or coordination? So those are the questions which will guide our discussion, and we've given those questions to our panelists. I'm very pleased to see that our final panelist has made it through Geneva Airport and made it pretty much on time for our event. Welcome, Dimitri. So now that we have our panel complete, we can get started. But just a couple of housekeeping matters to start with. I think you probably already spotted it, but we have a media-free zone right at the end of the room there for those of you in the room. We will be recording this event and taking photos. So if you don't want to be in the video or in photos, you can take a seat over there in that half of the room. If you want to connect your phone to the Wi-Fi, the code was up earlier, and it's also on the walls here if you want to connect your devices. Our debates use the Chatham House rule, just so that you're all aware. And then on the Q&A, once we've heard from our panelists, I'm going to ask the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes to start with. I'll then follow up with a question of myself to them, and then we'll open up the floor to you in the room and those of you online. We will take questions in written form from those online, but please put those in the chat, but do please keep them precise. Okay, so we're ready to get started. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Raji Rajagopalan. She is the Resident Senior Fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. Raji previously served as Director of the Centre for Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, and as an Assistant Director at India's National Security Council Secretariat. Raji, you're going to give us, although you're based in Australia, you're going to give us the Indian perspective on this topic. So please, over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and it's great to be here. It's always good to be back in Geneva. I was here in 20. I keep coming here, but a slightly longer stint. I was here when I was part of the UNGG on PAROS in 2018, 2019. So it's always great to be back here. And it's a great conversation. The subject, in a sense, you usually don't look at the role of private sector, what they do in the context of space, military space programs, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting tweak to how we generally look at space security. So let me try and give you a little bit of background in terms of where the Indian space program is coming from, in a sense. I'll start with that. So India, unlike a lot of other countries, has had a space program that has been almost entirely run by and led by a civil space organization, the Indian Space Research Organization. And of course, it has had a political and huge amount of political and popular support because it's been one of the rare public sector institutions that has done India proud in terms of the major achievements that it has done, all with a really small budget in a sense. So its ingenuity, its cost effectiveness, resilience, all of that have had several admirers, both at the popular level, but also among the political elites of the country. And especially some of the recent successes, whether it is the India's Mars mission a decade ago, or the Chandrayaan-3, the moon mission, or the solar missions, all of this have put India on the global map in terms of what a developing country can achieve in terms of these achievements, but also with a small budget. And it is no more seen as these are big boys' toys that other developing countries cannot aspire towards. So in that sense, many countries have looked at India with a lot of as a model, as an inspiration too, in a sense. So until recently, this journey was almost entirely state-driven. This is now changing. So the key question is, why is it changing? What's kind of driven this kind of an approach, in a sense, new changes in the Indian approach? And I think one of the most important reasons that I look at is that ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, can no longer keep up with the growing demand, and therefore there is a capacity deficit which is pushing India to kind of embrace the private sector as an important partner for for timely delivery. But increasingly, this has also become because driven by innovation, commercialization, and the possibilities of global collaboration. There is a global trend wherein governments are increasingly partnering with private players to begin to deliver on progress. And I think India is beginning to embrace that, but at a very slow pace, I might add. Therefore, in the last 5 years or so, we have seen a deliberate and strategic move by the Indian government to open up the space sector to private enterprise. Again, not as an afterthought, but as a key component of the national space policy. The Prime Minister's Modi's announcement in February, in summer of 2020, along with Finance Minister just a few weeks later in 2020, again, these were good starting points, but these were merely political announcements. How these are going to be converted into appropriate regulations and taken forward, I think that remains the key. Two key institutional innovations done by the government to step up industry participation were the establishment of New Space India Limited, NSIL, and InSpace. Again, these were, NSIL is a commercial public sector unit within the Department of Space, expected to encourage and facilitate private sector participation, commercializing the Indian private sector in the Indian space sector. This is, in fact, the second commercial wing of the ISRO after its earlier avatar called the Antrix, which was set up in 1992, but that was kind of folded in a sense. The goal of the NSIL is somewhat broader to facilitate transfer of technology to the private sector, help market space-based products, spin-off technologies. And to do this, NSIL is to seek a license from ISRO, following which a particular technology will be sub-licensed to commercial players. Similarly, there has been the establishment of InSpace, Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center, again, meant to create a level playing field for the private sector to work with the ISRO, including use of ISRO facilities, which is very, very sort of a remarkable and dramatic, because otherwise the private sector could not access ISRO's facilities until now. This, again, autonomous agency within the Department of Space acts as a single window facilitator, creator for private players, streamlining proposals, ensuring transparency, and enabling access to ISRO's infrastructure and expertise. But along with that, the government also introduced a new space policy in 2023, clearly outlining the role for ISRO in space and the private sector. In fact, this is almost a policy that is entirely written for the private sector, because when I was looking at from a national security space policy, I found the word security mentioned just once. So I was like, this is not it's not an overarching policy, but when you look at from a private sector engagement policy perspective, I think it's almost completely written meant for that in a sense. So I think in that sense, it has managed to clearly outline what is the kind of expected role, what are the kind of processes in place to enhance the private sector participation. So in that sense, it's been good, and the response so far has been again phenomenal. There are about 150 space tech startups that have come about in India. These are not merely suppliers or contractors, which was the case earlier in the Indian space story. So these new startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, they are building satellites, launch vehicles, propulsion systems, and various solutions in terms of providing for the remote sensing, geospatial analytics, and communication. And some of the pioneers in this space has been, one was the Skyroot Aerospace, again, which became the first Indian private sector company to launch a rocket. They are developing a Vikram series satellite launch rockets to launch into space with the help of ISRO's leadership. So the ISRO has been able to provide technical validation of their technologies and so on and so forth. So ISRO has been doing a bit of hand-holding with the private sector so that they can come about as more independent stakeholders in this whole thing. Second, another one is the Agnikul Cosmos, again, which has been developing customizable small launch vehicles with 3D printed engines. Companies like Pixel, I think these are again some of the examples where they are actually deploying Earth observation satellites and competing on a global scale. So there are a few entities that have actually managed to come about and competing with global commercial players as well. So the Indian private sector, especially the startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, there is so much of energy, talent, ambition, which are fantastic and something that the ISRO can actually make use of in order to step up India's own space competitiveness. Of course, they bring about agility, speed, all of that. And given that these are essentially unlike the large government programs, which are run by big bureaucracies, startups are generally nimble. They can work on solutions quickly, adopt new technologies faster, and so on and so forth. So making innovation come about at a much faster speed, and so on and so forth. They also bring about cost efficiency. Again, India has always been cost effective with its space missions, but bringing in private sector has had even additional layer of cost effectiveness, because these startups have no cost overhead, establishment cost, and so on and so forth. So I think the private sector, generally, you have seen them democratizing the space sector, but also making access to space a lot cheaper, and so on and so forth. So these are the possibilities. These are the kind of benefits, advantages. But this journey is, of course, there are still many challenges to come to overcome in a sense. One, I think for all the policy announcements that the government has made, there is need for a robust regulatory framework that ensures safety, sustainability, and clarity in terms of the roles and regulations without restricting innovation. Whether it is in terms of companies adhering to India's global commitments, whether it is in terms of space debris management, frequency allocation, liability norms, all of these require a lot more attention in terms of the regulatory space. Funding is another issue. While startups generally have attracted some amount of venture capitals from around the world, there is the need for deeper pools of capital through public-private partnership, defense offset, and other government incentives that are needed for long-term sustainability in a sense. So the whole question of integrating private sector has been a major challenge for India's space sector, because it's been completely a state-run program. At one level, I must add that this is not an entirely new phenomenon, because the private sector has had an involvement in India's space program for decades. But the relationship was different, that it was one of a contractual relationship. Significant segments, for instance, of the launch vehicle of the PSLV, India's Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, about 80% of the work was done by private industries, such as big companies, including Larsen & Toubro, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, and Godrej. Further back in 2016, about a decade ago, you had two satellites for the Indian navigation satellite constellation that went rogue, and there had to be a sort of a repair or put new satellites. Again, the ISRO was able to reach out to one of the private sector collaboration companies to provide this. But this is still happening in a sort of in a contractual way. ISRO doesn't have the capacity in-house, so you reach out to possible partners from outside and ask them to provide with you. This traditional model in which the private sector is limited to being contractors to this ISRO has only limited potential because it does not add to the overall size and capability of the Indian space sector. To do that latter, I think India will have to need to provide a fertile environment for the private sector to play a major role and contribute to India's space program, space capacity overall. Here, I think there are some of the issues that I've heard from a lot of the commercial players, including mostly startups and small and medium-sized enterprises. They have worries about funding, predictability in the legal sense, and IPR issues. And I think, and of course, India ISRO's gatekeeper approach than a facilitator role, I think that's also been stifling in a sense. ISRO has, ISRO chairman leadership at the top level have repeatedly kind of acknowledge the critical role that the private sector can play and contribute to India's effective space program. But I think they also enjoy the monopoly that they do enjoy. They don't want to leave the space open to other players who can be competitive and so on and so forth. So I think that's been a bit of a problem. But I think the key inhibiting factor for the private sector has to do with issues around intellectual property rights. And I think this is something that they have many companies, small and medium-sized enterprises have talked about. They remain concerned about the fact that they have to share intellectual property rights with the ISRO for all the technologies and products that the private sector has developed in a sense. So many continue to argue that unless there are fundamental changes being brought about in dealing with some of the IPR-related issues, private sector seems less enthused about their participation in a sense. Another issue is the absence of an independent regulator. Today, ISRO remains the promoter as well as the regulator of the space sector. I think that's something that the private sector is, again, waiting to see how it's going to pan out. There is a new space activities bill that has been in the making for close to a decade now. Now it's in its final stages as of May 2025. It is going for sort of consultations, feedback from other stakeholder ministries. But again, there the IPR issues have not been resolved. I think that's still something that it clearly says at this point in the draft bill that the IPR will always rest with the government. And I think that's something the industry finds it difficult to kind of collaborate and kind of cope with. So as of now, in some sense, at least, even as if there are 100-odd startups that have kind of embraced ISRO's, working with ISRO, there are still a good number of them who have left the country, either to come to Europe, US, or countries like Singapore, Australia, and other places, because they want to wait and watch, do a wait and watch approach to how the Indian space policy is kind of getting changes. One other issue with all of this is the policy. Even when there's a policy decision that has been taken, the timely implementation or the lack of a timely implementation has been one example I'll give you is the government took a decision sometime in 2016 to hand over the PSLV program completely to the private sector. It was thought that already the private sector is involved in the manufacturing of the PSLV to the tune of something like 80%. Why not give it to the ISRO? Doesn't have to focus on the routine commercial kind of launches and so on and so forth. And but again, this has been a decision taken in 2016, but we are still looking at a fuller implementation of that particular decision almost a decade later. Nevertheless, I would still say there is greater willingness today from the Indian establishment to explore the opportunities to work with the private sector than ever before. So that's something that we are kind of seeing a positive development in a sense. I have a few other things, but I'll come back to it later in terms of where the focus areas are in terms of the private sector engagement. That is on 2 satellite launch vehicles. One is the PSLV, which has been India's tried and tested workhorse in a sense. A second one that is in the process of being developed and near maturation is the small satellite launch vehicle, SSLV, which can again be used for large and more. But again, all of this is still, we are talking about in the civil sector. ISRO's willingness to engage the private sector in terms of the military space sector is still very, very low. And they are not exactly enthused about engaging the private sector on the strategic side of the developments. But India has come a long way in terms of opening up its conventional defense sector to the private sector in a big way in the last few years. which gives me some sense that maybe sooner than later you will also see this kind of playing out in the space sector, space domain as well. But the key questions to ask are, how do you create the right balance between rules and regulations on the one hand, but at the same time they don't stifle innovation, and one that gives the private sector a key independent stakeholdership in a sense. What kind of sectors can you open up to the private sector? Are you going to be limiting them to the telecommunications and routine missions, or would you engage them to create on the strategic side of things also? And the key issue is always to do with the mindset. Don't look at the private sector as the other that you can't really engage. So how do you get around? Again, the space activities bill is ready, it's being circulated, but a lot of elements that I see in there is still being seen with the private sector can be engaged for non-strategic programs, but when it comes to commercial engagement, it is still limited to routine missions and so on and so forth. So on the military space side of things, I'm not very hopeful, at least as of today. Maybe in the 5 years, 10 years time, things will change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Raji, for giving us the Indian perspective. And it does sound as if at the moment, it sounds like there's a lot going on and a big expansion of the role of the private sector. But at the moment, as you were saying, it's more on the civil side than it is on the military side. Could you just give us a flavour of what the debates would be, or the caution about the defence sector getting, the commercial sector getting more involved with the defence sector? Because I think that's quite an interesting perspective for the question about the militarization of space and why or why not the commercial sector is or is not getting involved with it.
No, I think it's a great question, because I think this is something that I've also been trying to kind of deal with in a sense, in some ways, because what is it that makes the government somewhat suspicious of the private sector? Somehow profit is seen as something very bad, something negative, unless they're not engaged in a charity business. Let's be clear about that. They are making money, they are making profits, but at the same time, if they didn't have any profits, they are not going to be engaged in this kind of a business at the end of the day. So I think framing appropriate regulations that would, because one of the key concerns for India has always been if we want to engage these entities in the strategic sector or the security sector, who are their partners going to be? Are they going to partner with which companies, which countries outside of India would they partner with, and so on and so forth? But I think there you can actually come up with, the right set of regulations to make sure that there can be a competition clause, for instance. Who do you compete with? Who do you partner with? In which countries? And so the like-minded countries, like-minded coalitions. So you can partner with companies from other certain countries, but not from certain other countries. You can come up with clauses, regulations of a kind. So one that would still provide for stepping up India's competitiveness in the military space segment, because India has to do more. ISRO doesn't have the capacity. The whole engagement of the private sector has been done or accepted by ISRO with the recognition that ISRO can actually go back to focusing on its original mandate of space exploration, research, and so on and so forth. And the routine stuff is really handed over to the private sector. But again, these are things that ISRO is still not. Even when the Indian government made the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister made those announcements in the summer of 2020, ISRO had a very lukewarm response in a Twitter, on a tweet, which said, okay, we will work with the government with whatever. So they were not particularly happy with the government saying that private sector is going to be given a bigger space to operate on, and that they can actually use the ISRO facilities and so on and so forth. They were not particularly enthused about it. Like I said, they do enjoy that monopoly. They don't want to open up the space that would actually bring about competition, and that's kind of role.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Raji. I think the Indian case, or the development of the Indian space sector, is going to be a fascinating one to follow. Okay, we're going to move to our next speaker. Mr. Sergei Gugaev, who is an executive in residence fellow here at the GCSP. Sergei is the former chief executive officer of Sea Launch and the former chief commercial officer of ClearSpace. Sergei, you're going to talk to us about this question from the commercial sector perspective. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much for being here. So yeah, I'll try to give a brief overview of the private space sector playing a role in the current military environment. So I'll start with a quote from a German economist from 19th century that said that for 300% profit, the capital can break any law and commit any crime to get it. So the time has changed since 19th century, but the question of the profit for the private business remains a big question. And currently a lot of entrepreneurs are coming into the space industry to change the world for the best, and not only for the profit. Or maybe there are a few billionaires that came into space industry to become trillionaires, but overall, I think people working in the space sector, they are visionary. They are trying to change the world for the best. However, and over the last decade, there have been tremendous investments going into the private space industry. There are many startups, many innovations, many R&Ds that have been before carried out by huge companies, huge corporations, or state corporations, now are emerging into private startups. So few figures. So currently there is 570 billion revenues in the space industry. They were in 2023. There are some experts saying that the space economy will reach 1 trillion in cumulative revenues by the end of this decade. So this is pretty significant. And what we also see is that there are a lot of private investments, venture capital firms, business angels investing in private space companies. So from 1 billion in 2014, we are seeing right now 15 billion global investments into the space industry. So the question is that the private companies want to participate not only in the civil programs but in some defense and military programs. And there are two parts of the coin. So one is that on one side, the private companies can quicker innovate, can reduce deployment cycle. The research and development is quicker than versus big state-owned or big corporations, and apparently they should be more cost-effective. That's what they're claiming. On the other side, space is hard. It's although all these investments, it's difficult to raise money, and it's difficult to come up to the market with a product. It's not consumer electronics where you can sell thousands or millions of your devices. Space products are really unique. It takes time to develop, but now the changes in the industry, the access to space, and the different standardization makes space more affordable. That's why the private companies are looking sometimes to participate in defense and military programs. Sometimes they're doing it because they created their company to support civil industry, but the cash, the amount of money in this industry, let's say agriculture or disaster management, looking at deforestation, is much less than that you have in the military budgets. The military is currently, in the current geopolitical environment, is putting billions of euros in their programs, in their military programs, and space is a one big domain of military operations. So the fundamental paradigm shift that we have seen in the space is that if before 10, 20 years, private companies were acting as a supplier for military and defense, for example, for anti-satellite tests performed by US. So the rocket was delivered by Raytheon or McDonnell Douglas, big companies. So, but they were just a supplier. The military were operating all of that. So now the fundamental shift is that currently it's the operational part that goes to the private actors. So the biggest example is, of course, SpaceX, and I think Starlink constellation that probably we'll be discussing more. But that's the big change right now that we're seeing in all global conflicts, in the battlefields, that there is a huge role of the private actors in the military operations, for good and for bad. I think that's the question for a debate, and we will see what comes next. But this is something that cannot be ignored in future. And the question is that we already are seeing the private military companies participating in different battlefields from different countries. So now we are coming to a situation where private companies, not governments, can participate actively in harsh military operations. And the question is, do we want it? Do we want mercenaries to be in space, acting in a really sensitive on the sensitive matters, and who will control them? What are the ethical boundaries for these actors? Are they driven by profit or by some regulations or belief? So these are the questions that our society and the global space industry and governments and regulators will have to deal with. But the bottom line is that we are facing right now a fundamental change in how the private companies are operating in the military space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey. From a commercial perspective, obviously, the big profits that can be potentially made by getting into the defense sector, militarization of space, is very attractive to these companies. But from their perspective, what risks do they see in getting involved with military operations? I mean, for those of us who study international security, we can see quite a few risks with assets being used in a dual-use way, civilian and military, and that's one of the reasons why we're having this discussion today. But is it a little bit for them just the pursuit of profits will come above everything, or do they actually recognize that there are risks involved for them as well, and how do we have that discussion?
It's a great question, and you're right to the topic that currently in the geopolitical environment, the companies, the private space sectors, they need to take a decision on which side they will be. So for companies that want to do, let's say, civilian Earth observation, if they participate in a military program of one state, it's almost clear that they cannot do business with some other countries which are geopolitical rivals right now. So it's very difficult to have a kind of Nutella product that, you know, who owns it? Everyone owns it, and so companies there are certain regulations that are governing these kind of dual-use technologies. But the answer is yes. You need to choose with which blocks or with which countries do you work with.
And you have to do your risk assessment as well in terms of whether it's commercially viable to be getting involved with the potential conflict, which is what we have seen already. Yeah. Okay, Sergey, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Thomas Gonzalez-Roberts. He is incoming Assistant Professor of International Affairs and Aerospace Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. You've had quite a journey to be here, Thomas, because you traveled from the States to be here. But you've also been in Geneva serving as the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU's first academic in residence. So we're delighted to have you here with both those hats on. You're going to talk to us about the space traffic management and coordination issues that are thrown up with this massive expansion of the private sector in space. So Thomas, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me here, Simon. And thank you for that kind introduction. In my work, I'm trained as an astrodynamicist, which means I study space object behavior. I track and characterize where satellites and fragmented satellites are in orbit around the Earth, which is a practice that we do in the scientific community regardless of the purpose of each of these objects. And the methods by which we do that work is similar, even though the need to know where objects are obviously varies greatly based on what its purpose or current function is. So I hope to chat a little bit more about that. At Georgia Tech, I lead a research laboratory dedicated to international coordination, sustainability, and security in outer space. And in my work, I really take a population-based approach here, where I study satellites regardless of critical satellite characteristics, like who operates them, for what purpose, how long they've been in the operational environment, and what their past or future might be. And those are sort of the key tools for the broader field of space traffic management, which I describe as the systematic use of limited natural resources in the near-Earth space environment, namely physical space in desirable orbits. Space is vast, but the real estate where satellite operators actually want to be to do all the classes of military operations we're going to describe on this panel, those are limited. And what we always forget in the physical science community is that there's another limited natural resource at play here, which is the radio frequency spectrum, specifically the frequency bands allocated to space services by the International Telecommunication Union. Just down the road. It's so close to the security community, but yet so far, really. And the mechanisms for why satellite operators need to abide by systems of coordination for the distribution of those limited natural resources, those mechanisms are fragmented. They vary by state in some cases. They're often based on both legally binding and non-legally binding resolutions and treaties. So sometimes operators must do these things and other times they don't need to and they're voluntary. And even in cases when they're legally bound to share information about what their satellites are doing, some of those treaties are inherently not enforceable. So in my academic work, I study rule following and rule breaking in the outer space environment. In cases when states or individual satellite operators, and it's really important, especially on this panel, to acknowledge the difference between those two nodes here. A state may be a satellite operator, a civil space agency, a military agency within a state, but the vast majority of satellites are operated by commercial satellite operators who must adhere to the regulations of their state as described in Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, but are not the same thing as the state. Just as maybe a brief aside, an individual company within a state that is bound by the Outer Space Treaty may choose which state regulates it around the world in many different cases. SpaceX, for example, and it's only fair to use SpaceX as an example as the world's largest satellite operator, operating more than 2/3 of all active satellites in orbit today. They have subsidiary companies in other states that benefit from looser regulatory environments than the mission authorization framework in the United States, which is the most comprehensive but earns regular criticism from the private space industry. So there are some real challenges in space traffic management. Some of this extend all the way back to the earliest era of space flight. What we're doing here from a sort of a technical perspective is I want you to imagine it as just taking pictures of the sky. We're looking at photo after photo of mostly black rectangles with little pixels that are lit up that represent the sun's light reflected off of a reflective surface of a satellite, usually its solar panel. And we do that with a limited number of sensors. That optical example is for optical telescopes, which are great for some portions of the near-Earth space environment. We also use radar systems that are mostly on the ground, still sort of staring up, to get these little bits of evidence about where satellites are. So to get more valuable information, like a satellite's orbital trajectory, we stitch all of these pieces of data together with limited resources. No matter how many sensors you have, you can look at a map of the US Space Force Space Surveillance Network. You might think from almost every perspective that that's a lot of sensors. They might argue that that's not enough, because satellites, especially those in low Earth orbit, where most satellites are not observed continuously. Meaning in an environment where we're seeing more satellite operators perform maneuvers in different ways than we're used to, that's opportunities for satellites to change their orbital characteristics outside of the view of a satellite sensor, making it harder to figure out where satellites are. And I can tell you with my work that satellites that are from the commercial sector that service military clients do that work more often. They're performing more maneuvers than other satellites of other characteristics. That makes sort of what I would call real-time or authoritative space traffic management nearly impossible and ripe for miscalculation and escalation, where estimates of space object behavior differ based on who has access to what information. What I described earlier was passive data collection. But we also live in a world where satellites are controlled by people who have email accounts and phone numbers, where I can just call them up and to ask them, please, just tell me where your satellite is. This process of looking at the sky is really annoying and quite inefficient. And many operators have leaned into, in the name of good space sustainability stewardship, the practice of voluntarily sharing information, doing things like publishing orbital elements online so I can skip the whole orbit determination process, thank God. Or telling me even higher resolution information than that, like what maneuvers they've performed in the past and what maneuvers they will perform in the future. And that is a gross departure from the history of spaceflight, where I would call it sort of steeped in the culture of secrecy, because of the earliest satellite missions being entirely military in nature. But that paradigm, as Sergey was mentioned, is shifting. To be an entirely military satellite makes less and less sense from the perspective of military space agencies. It's more attractive from an efficiency perspective, an innovation perspective, and simply cost to contract with private satellite operators who can do the same work for less. And so that's an interesting shift we're living in right now, and it's sort of unclear where it will go. States and satellite operators share information at different rates and often entirely within their control. So if you see a good space steward now, they might not be a good space steward tomorrow when it really counts. So I advocate in my work for a sort of new space traffic management framework. I'm certainly not alone. We're off the heels of the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space meeting at Vienna this month, where there are competing proposals for space traffic management frameworks from good-intentioned states to come up with ways to encourage states and satellite operators to share information when they currently don't. So to help with that process, I study norms of behavior in outer space to help, from a data-driven perspective, determine what behavior is statistically abnormal, which is different than malicious. Anomalous is different than malicious, meaning a satellite that just behaves a little differently than it normally does is not necessarily malicious behavior. I advocate for systems that promote transparency, especially for dual use operations. So a commercial satellite that does have a contract with a military space agency likely has many more contracts than that, meaning only a fraction of the time are they wearing a military hat. Or you might think about it in a different way. If they're constantly collecting data, only some of that data ever gets in the hands of a military space agency. They can be more transparent about that data sharing. And I want to highlight the opportunity of the existing mechanisms, including at COPUS, as I mentioned, in Vienna, but just down the road here at the ITU. The ITU brags that it's the world's oldest international organization, which is true. It was founded in 1865 to coordinate telegraph messages across international borders. But it's based on living treaties that change with technology. So at the next World Radio Conference in 2027, we have an opportunity to create new legally binding rules that have the possibility of being followed at great rates to encourage the more coordinated, sustainable, and secure use of those limited natural resources that I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. That was fascinating. I have lots of questions I want to ask you, but I'll just pick one. Your work on a space traffic management framework. What do you think the prospects are for achieving that? Given that there are different proposals out there, and there are countries that don't necessarily want to share with other countries. Should it be some kind of comprehensive framework, or do we need separate ones? I was thinking particularly on the issue of mega constellations. There's clearly a governance gap there, I think. Does that need something specific, or would it be all wrapped up in one framework?
I come from a big community of space traffic management analysts and advocates, and if you ask different people from that community, you would get different answers. So some of our colleagues at CopUS are shooting for the stars here. They're advocating for the creation of a comprehensive framework, so the mandatory requirement of sharing some of these key satellite parameters. But I'm a lot easier to please than that, because I've spent my career sort of using little clues. If you spend a lot of time in like a windowless laboratory looking at those mostly black images, you learn to accept little bits of information with a bit more of a smile on your face. So I really see opportunities for just a small amount of what I call administrative due diligence when you tell satellite, your peers really around the world, when you intend to use certain portions of those limited natural resources, especially when they're contested. Because you should do that out of your desire to use those resources in a protected way. You should seek some protections. We see that in practice at the ITU in exchange for some burden. That could be filing paperwork, hiring a legal team in your small space startup, for example. But it also means sharing a bit of your plan, so pulling the curtain back. I think that there's a lot of room between today's paradigm of entirely free operations in space, where a satellite operator, there are no rules or laws that tell them how to burn their thrusters or change their orbital trajectories. They can do whatever they want using whatever technology they want. Despite having all that freedom, satellite operators aren't using all of that freedom. You can create some constraints that entirely enclose their pattern of life, both in the past and in the future, while making a more predictable and safe environment, especially in those populated orbital regimes.
Okay, thank you. And I guess as the private sector gets more involved in the military matters, that might make the transparency harder, because perhaps governments would not want to be volunteering as much information as we would like them to do. But we will see how that plays out. Thank you very much, Thomas. I'd like now to introduce our final speaker, Dmitry Stefanovic, who is a research fellow at the Center for International Security at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Scientists. Dmitry, welcome. I'm very pleased you're here. I know you had a difficult journey to get here, but we're very pleased that you made it. You're going to give us the Russian perspective on this question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And well, I've made it, and this is what matters. I'd say that I'll provide a broader perspective on the issue we are trying to track, and then within it, I will also focus on some of the Russian capabilities. So first, the space militarization never stopped. It was like original sin, as some people call it. Space was military. Space exploration was military. And it is also natural for the private sector to pursue military contracts because, as was earlier said by my colleagues, there are more money there. And that money will be provided for longer periods of time. Although, as we see what's going on with the US space budget, things might change rapidly. Okay, but still, this money comes with a price. Sorry for saying it this way, and I will speak more on that later. I suggest to briefly look at 6 provisional baskets of private space activities that contribute to military operations and military capabilities. First basket is the most obvious one, is the launch services. SpaceX was mentioned several times already. There are other launch service providers, and it is the most straightforward area. And probably this is the source of the current rapid development of mega constellations and so on, and of the challenges that we're discussing here. Russia is lacking such private capabilities at the moment, but the demand for launch services is growing, and probably we will come up with something. At the same time, for example, China has a lot of private launch providers, but those launch providers very often share some governmental heritage, to put it this way. Then second basket is communication services. Again, Starlink, but also OneWeb. Here in Russia, we have some good developments like Bureau 1440. There are a number of Chinese providers also working on mega constellations. And here, I believe the most important thing to know is that private sector, a commercial provider, developed a much better solution than any military could have come up with. And also with Starlink, we see that there is a first baby steps to separate commercial businesses and military businesses, which might, if it will work out with the Starshield project, we might see that it is actually possible to draw a line between military service and commercial service from a non-governmental entity. And also, if we take a step from military security to the general security, then these communication services might be used to overcome state control of information flows. And I'm not saying whether it is good or bad, but this is something that might eventually be a point of contention between governments and commercial services, commercial actors. The third basket is the space situational awareness. And here we have quite significant commercial capabilities being developed, like Leo Labs and others. So the reality is that now we don't have a state monopoly on seeing and assessing what is going on in space. Of course, we've had a community of people surfing the radio waves and looking at their amateur telescopes and sometimes noticing some strange behavior of this or that spacecraft. But now the capability, the non-governmental capability reached and continuously developing new levels. And what might be even more important, the commercial actors are not shy to actually shed light on what they perceive as troubling activities by this or that spacecraft of select countries. And it would be really good that they would not that specific about the countries they look at. The fourth basket is Earth imaging, and we all heard names like Maxa, Umbra, ISI, again, assorted Chinese providers, and again, nothing to brag about from the Russian perspective. This is what most people like to look at, and it can be, and actually is being used for propaganda purposes, for intelligence gathering, and so on. And there is a lack of balance here because clearly commercial actors publicize images of the countries they see as adversarial countries much more often than the countries they are somehow related to or are more afraid of. The most troubling dynamic here is the increased involvement of private contractors in the provision of ISR capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, including real-time capabilities, including tracking of mobile targets. Again, eventually it brings those contractors into crosshairs. Coming back to Russia, we're at the early stages of the development of this market of commercial satellite images. A lot of decisions has been made over last several years to make it more viable. So there will be more interest in investments in such capabilities from the commercial sector. But at the moment, most private companies are mostly engaged in reselling satellite images they procure elsewhere and some basic analysis of those. The fifth basket is on-orbit servicing, and companies like Astra, like Rogue, might eventually become a very disruptive capability. Unlike some other areas of space activities, it seems that here the governments are more interested in giving the first dance to the commercial actors just to try whether it will actually work out. And such delegation is happening especially in the US, and capabilities like refueling, repairs, engaging in orbital maneuvers, helping with orbital maneuvers, to non-maneuverable spacecraft. This stuff is extremely interesting. There are numerous benign reasons to engage in such activities, but also it's not that hard to come up with malign scenarios. And here, transparency is crucial. Finally, the sixth basket is the commercial support for general space architecture, like, for example, for early warning, for space control, or even for missile defense, as we see in the US these days. It is less material and observable compared to other baskets I've mentioned, but still it is very important. Personally, I was extremely surprised when I saw reports that some US commercial actors are actually engaged in providing services in using some artificial intelligence technologies and so on to link the legacy and future US early warning capabilities. Like, this is something as strategic as someone might imagine, and this actually means that they're part of the highest level of possible military confrontation. And of course, with the US Golden Dome, the dynamics might become even more dramatic. So the important part here, from my perspective, is that the provision of any space services by a company from country A for the military actors from country B, or even non-state military actors. Because if these state or non-state militants are engaged in conflict with or even within country C, then country C might eventually come up with an idea that it should engage in a military confrontation with country A, or at least with this commercial actor. So this is where the ultimate price, or rather ultimate costs of private companies involved in military activities. Today, it looks like many commercial actors are basically painting and target marks on their backs without fully understanding the implications. Although it's great that we have this discussion here, and more and more people are starting to ask questions. Simultaneously, while it's not the case now, the over-reliance of military services on commercial infrastructure gives room to significant vulnerabilities to the militaries, and also eventually might undermine like due processes and so on within the military contracting. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to another quite troubling possibility. Imagine a space launch startup with good rocket building expertise and some know-hows, which runs into debt, loses investments, and basically is going to sink. And then suddenly some gentlemen or ladies come up with big bags full of money, offering to buy their technologies, their expertise, or even hire them, but to develop long-range ballistic missile capabilities for undisclosed operators. Given the very extremely sad state of the missile technology control regime, such a scenario seems quite real, because there were cases in the past where delivery of space-related technology actually contributed to ballistic missile developments in some countries. So my very final point would be that not long ago, in many countries, private companies were actually very much involved in the development and proliferation of sophisticated military capabilities. So to some extent, we're getting back to normal. But I'm not sure that it will make anyone safer. And that I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dmitry, for your perspective. I wanted to follow up on something you said under your second basket about the separation of military from civilian activities. I mean, is that really possible in today's world? I mean, aren't the two now so intertwined that that's going to be very difficult to achieve?
It is extremely difficult, but it doesn't mean that we or they shouldn't try, because the alternative is much harder when it's not only about space, because it will be like a free-for-all, the hunting season for any capability that is perceived as military. So at least to try to separate them, to try to engage in explaining that like this part is not providing any services to the militaries, or this stuff that we are doing, developing this capability for military purpose, but this military purpose has nothing to do with imposing risks or costs for other countries. I think greater transparency here can be a very good first step.
Yeah, I was just about to say that for that to work, you need much greater transparency than we have at the moment, and in the current geopolitical context, that's difficult. Yeah, please. No, yeah.
No, just one, that particular point, even I was noting it down, like it's extremely challenging. But I think something that is going to make it even more complicated is that private sector will also be launching mixed payloads. So if a country A wants to target country B's, a particular launch in some way or the other, the mixed payloads that are being there. So you're going to be targeting essentially not just the military payloads that you want to target, but you're also targeting the civilian payloads that is carried by. So it's I think it's getting a lot more murkier, and I don't know for the separation to happen, a lot more transparency. I'm not very hopeful that we are going to see through in this point of time.
Yeah, this is absolutely correct point. I would also add that probably the only stabilizing factor so far is that everyone kind of relies on space services, and there is an understanding that, like, yeah, even if your space capabilities are a bit lesser than your adversary, but losing even this small share would be a major blow. So, like, no one is so far at the moment, and it might happen like any time, no one so far is engaged in actual like military activities in terms of taking down space infrastructure once and for all, because everyone relies on this space infrastructure. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm just turning to Florian now. I'm going to put my microphone down. The microphones are now on the ceiling, so we panelists don't need to use our microphones anymore. Just to say, I'm going to take questions from the floor, and also we might be getting some online as well. I'll collect up a few, and then I'll let our panelists respond. So please put your hand up if you would like to ask a question. Please tell us who you are and your affiliation. Please, Andreas.
Well, I also have a microphone on the...
No, just go for it, because the microphones are in the ceiling.
Thank you. Andreas speaking from the Austrian Permanent Mission here in Geneva. I just, first of all, I want to thank all the panelists for being here and giving us their insights. I think it has been extremely refreshing, especially for us diplomats, because it's giving a more on-hands view on something where we have been discussing on a more normative or maybe legal sphere. At the same point, maybe I also want to bring back this dimension into the panel discussion, because obviously there is a normative framework that applies, which is the Outer Space Treaty and the other outer space treaties that are also out there in the legal sphere. So this is a sphere that is not completely unregulated. We have especially Article 6, which is extremely relevant for this topic. And Article 6 is not a short article, it also provides for general supervision and authorization of any kind of space activities. So there is a strong obligation for states to oversee and also to take responsibility on what private actors under their flag are doing in outer space. So how does this apply to all these kind of discussions? And maybe a second point, I think the assumption also needs to be that commercial actors in space there's nothing wrong with this. This is the right thing to do, since space is intended also according to Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty for peaceful use mostly. And maybe a third point that I also want to make, what I heard here today is more or less an assumption that it's given that military use of outer space is a thing and is increasing. I mean, we wouldn't disagree when it comes to the dual use and the military use of space assets that has always been there in its history. But the growing militarization of outer space, again, from a normative point of view, is not in line with the Outer Space Treaty, at least with Article 1, but also not with the many commitments that we states have entered with resolutions and with SSOD1 since decades now. So this development is also very concerning, and maybe you can also speak a little bit about this, maybe this division between the normative approach and what is there in the legal domain and what is the realpolitik dual use problem that we are seeing.
Thank you very much indeed, Andreas. I've had two questions online as well. Actually, the first one I'm going to read out is on dual use, so it's similar to what you just asked. So the question is, may I ask about the dual use technologies in space? What diplomatic tools or confidence building measures could be prioritized to reduce misperceptions among major powers? And then, Sergey, there's one here for you, and I'll read it out to you. It says, do current public-private partnership, PPP models, adequately define responsibility and liability for private actors engaging in dual-use launches? Or do we now require a multilateral framework capable of regulating intent and technical function beyond national licensing regimes? Okay, let's take that group of questions. Maybe we'll go back same order we started with. So Raji, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure.
You don't need that.
I don't need
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you. No, I think that were great questions, and I think, I think this is something that I think states are trying to educate the private sector within their national boundaries to say that states that have already committed to certain all the various treaties and measures, even the private sector bodies, their activities are going to be bound by that. But I think here is where the need for new regulations to get those private entities to comply with them in an effective manner. I think that's something that states are still struggling, at least from the Indian side. I know that I think this is something that is still being done and not there as yet in a sense. But I think on the something larger point, militarization of space, I think that's something that has already happened, and I think we are all dealing with that in many different ways, with most militaries around the world using space for military activities. That's a given, and especially in the last 2 decades, I think that has accelerated in a sense, given the what we are seeing today. One, I think something slightly different from the Cold War is space, permeated use of space in the conventional military operation, which was not the case during the Cold War. Space was being used by military for strategic operations. That's a huge difference that you see. But in today, you have space being used in the conventional conflict in a much bigger way. And I think that's precisely and of course, you have in the backdrop, an important contextualizing factor of the changing geopolitical equations and the balance of power dynamics that come into play. And therefore, states want to see what is it that they can do, given especially the intensified role for space in conventional military. How is that? What is that you can target on the adversary? And I think given that space has become such an important aspect in conventional military, and that's precisely the reason why you see increasingly counter space capabilities being developed. And I think here is where we are not necessarily entirely, we are concerned about militarization of space, but I think militarization of space is given. What we are really worried about is the weaponization of space. And I think that differentiation is important, that we continue to have that. So how do you prevent weaponization of space, the current trends that we are seeing, in order to, because like I think Thomas was saying, the usable orbits in space are limited in nature. So how do you preserve the sanctity? And space, like many of the other domains, space is truly a global commons. Space is not going to be space debris. It's not going to make a differentiation between country A, B, C, and D. It is going to affect every single country, irrespective of who launched a particular ASAT or who launched who engaged in a certain activity that resulted in the creation of space debris and so on and so forth. So I think the weaponization of space is what we are really worried about and trying to kind of prevent in a sense. There is possibly a limited window of opportunity for states to engage in discussions, negotiations, and to come up with some sort of a global measure, because many of the existing treaties, space is not truly bereft of laws and regulations. They have been there from the 60s onwards. But many of the contemporary challenges in space cannot be dealt with those outer space treaty to other measures. Contemporary challenges being cyber warfare in space or electronic warfare in space. None of those issues are going to be tackled with the outer space treaty because it has a limited mandate of preventing the placement of weapons of mass destruction, but it doesn't really talk about the conventional weapons or non-WMD weapons in space. So I think that's a huge loophole that you need to fix. And to fix that, you have had a series of proposals that have gone through in the last almost 2 decades, but none have really come to a fruition because of the balance of power politics, not because countries don't recognize the problems or don't recognize. There are issues even there, even getting countries to agree on the set of challenges first. To some country, it may be space debris and traffic management, which is a bigger issue. For another set of countries, it could be the arms race, which has become a much bigger issue, and so on and so forth. So getting countries even to agree on the set of challenges first and then to think through what are the possible ways of dealing with them, solutions. I think that's a second aspect, but I think those are unfortunate features of the current balance of power politics, and the geopolitical factors can't be overlooked in a sense. And I'm sure you would appreciate that given your previous role and so on and so forth. But I think norms of responsible behavior, openness, transparency, I think those are absolutely must do things before things really go out of control and something catastrophic happens in space. And somehow when we talk about norms of responsible behavior, it is seen by a large number of states as something that is, out of the extraordinary. It is something that, just proposed by a certain number of countries to bring about restraint or to prevent their space development and so on and so forth. But it's actually very commonsensical sort of a behavior, good courtesy behavior, that is good behavior that is expected of as a good citizen in a sense. That is, to put it in very simple rudimentary terms, but somehow, again, conveying that and getting a larger number of states to endorse norms of responsible behavior is something very important. You can exactly simplify this and say, what is a good behavior in space? Increasingly, we are having to codify those things in some sort of a code of conduct or some sort of a treaty or any sort of a TCBM, transparency and confidence building measure. It can be as simple as, is it a good thing that you throw garbage in your neighbor's yard, neighbor's backyard? Is that a good behavior? You don't do that. So maybe we need to start codifying that there. Or something to talk about cyber electronic interference in space, you can ask a question. Tampering with your neighbor's TV antenna, is it a good behavior or not? It's not. So maybe now we are increasingly at a time when we are having to put these things down, each of the things as good behavior, good responsible behavior and irresponsible behavior. So many states, even countries like India, which have been in the space business for a while now, have faced difficulties when it comes to norms of responsible behavior, somehow fearing that responsible behavior can be subjectively interpreted. So I think there's a lot more outreach that needs to happen to explain as to what is responsible behavior. And if you get into the tent and talk about these issues along with the other partners, I think you have a chance at shaping those norms of responsible behavior and getting a large number of countries to endorse in a sense.
Okay, thank you. Sergey, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to respond on your comment regarding the Outer Space Treaty, that indeed is a governing law, international treaty. I think at the time when the Outer Space Treaty was about to be developed and adopted, no one could think about such a big number of private actors, and one of the precedents that from this Outer Space Treaty, which goes really beyond this Outer Space Treaty, was this example of SpaceX Starlink that was used in the Ukrainian conflict during the Ukrainian operation on Crimea, when the Starlink terminals were off. And at that time, I mean, we can debate, and I don't think there is a clear explanation on that, whether it's sanctions, which was a technical problem. But the fact is that a private actor took a decision on a kind of a strategic military standpoint. And this is a precedent that probably we will see more or we will not see more. But this goes outside of how the Outer Space Treaty and the governments responsible for these activities have been struck. And a small comment to the private partnerships for the launch capabilities. Of course, it's the national government that gives the launch licenses to the private state actors, whatever, and is responsible for the satellites that have been deployed under the governments. But of course, you have international coordination. For example, when you launch a rocket, a civil rocket, the rocket is flying over different zones, and there is aviation, there are airplanes, and all the air traffic is shut down for X amount of hours during the flight, and same for the maritime. So there is a big number of events from the international coordination that should take place and are taking place. So this is very important.
Okay, thank you, Zeke. Thomas, would you like to say something?
Sure. I'm glad you brought up Article 6 because, and you highlighted it, it's an obligation of supervising non-state activities happening within the state. But the phrase is actually continuous supervision, which I think is in just a 2-word phrase, continuous supervision, evidence that this was written in an era when they were predicting space operations, not when they were experiencing space operations that resemble those we see today. So the idea of continuously supervising an object could be interpreted by different states to mean different things. As I'm not a state myself, but I might interpret it to mean always having an eye on an object. No state has that capability, even in 2025. Certainly not in 1967. So states are authorizing the launch of objects and they cannot keep an eye on them. So perhaps continuous supervision could be interpreted instead as regularly keeping administrative track of an object. So if it's a company within your state, you ask them on a regular basis, is that object still where you said it was? Is it still using its frequencies that I have allocated it? States regularly don't do that, including those that authorize the largest number of satellites, creating paradigms in which satellite operators can seek authorization to use more frequency bands than they really need and enjoy those protections without being asked later. The foundation is there, the Outer Space Treaty, but also I would like to bring up the Registration Convention and the Liability Convention to make sure if satellites cause damages to one another, it's clear which state is responsible. Those were also written during a time when we thought we understood what space operations looked like, but we really couldn't predict it accurately. So for example, in the Registration Convention, states are asked to share some information about the purpose of a satellite and its location, its orbital trajectory. But as we now know, satellites are maneuvering and changing their orbital trajectories. And those changes make those initial orbital elements, even if a state fulfilled its obligations and filed that with the Secretariat, totally moot. Like I really mean that. Completely useless to describe what a satellite, where a satellite is. Or in an era, we call this era dynamic space operations, where satellites change what they're doing over time for totally real and measurable reasons. Like for a military actor, the threat on the ground changes. So you got to move where a satellite is to change its coverage. Or a commercial actor, like for example, Starlink, they can massage the orientation of their constellation to fulfill subscribers' needs on the ground. This is not crazy stuff. It's totally normal space observations. But like imagine in the future, I can look forward, but I know I'm going to fail, just like the writers of the 67 Outer Space Treaty tried their best and failed. So I can look into the future and imagine a dynamic space operations where you see satellite services, like remote services. So one satellite goes up to another and helps change out the payload or add more fuel or perform propulsion systems itself. That changes the purpose of a satellite after registration. So we can continue to ask states to register their objects, which they also don't do that on a regular basis, by the way. The requirement is to furnish that information as soon as practicable. And we see states waiting years on end to file their registration. So in the only case of a collision on orbit between a defunct Russian satellite and an operational US commercial satellite, the US commercial satellite wasn't registered. So thankfully, there was no international suit for liability because it hadn't been registered at the time. So the liability convention would be difficult to administer. I hope that answers like my little flavor.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That's great. Dimitri, you wanted to comment as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't speak a lot because most of what I wanted to say has already been said. Just 2 points. One on continuous observation of satellites. Actually, funny or not, but this is something that is being continuously raised between Russian and American experts. There was even an official process in late 90s, early 2000s to develop a joint data exchange center. And there are numerous proposals of how to link the space situational awareness, space domain awareness, space control capabilities, just to have a continuous picture of what is going on, because there is an absolutely clear understanding that it is more than possible that something happens when neither Russian nor American assets see what happened, and then everyone starts the blame game, and we're in a very bad situation. So there are a lot of ideas how to make it work, but unfortunately we are not in that political environment yet, although it looks like a relatively low-hanging fruit. Second point about militarization, weaponization, and prevention of arms race in space. There is probably a lot of people in this room know, but there is I think, partly artificial conflict between the idea that there should be norms of responsible behavior or there should be a treaty on prevention of placement of weapons in space. Several years ago, it looked like the gap was becoming narrower. There was acknowledgement that, okay, we can start with norms, then come up with a treaty. Now I think we're a bit farther away, but the good news is that there was a final document from the open-ended working group, and that provided quite a significant number of ideas and acknowledged the need for legally binding documents. So hopefully there will be an official process of bridging the gap, of having a joint list of issues that we are concerned with, that every country is concerned with.
That was a group of governmental
Sorry,
Yeah.
of course. GG, sorry. It's my, yeah. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Probably my final thing would be that, of course, the Outer Space Treaty does not provide for a lot of challenges that we have today, but this doesn't mean that state actors or commercial actors can't walk an extra mile. As one, I think, diplomat said at one event devoted to the Hague Code of Conduct, that like there is baseline requirement for reporting, but it doesn't mean that you can like take 2 steps above this baseline reporting. And this is, I think, where responsible behavior might start to develop when the countries and probably non-state actors will start to take extra steps to provide information about what the satellites are doing, because otherwise their satellites will get in the harm's way.
Okay, thank you very much. Yvette, please. Yeah.
Yes. No, first of all, let me thank the panel. I think we have been well educated on the whole question of militarization of outer space, considering all the presentations we've had. Now, I know, I mean, we're talking about militarization, but we do know the good that outer space could present, both in terms of development, you know, and we need to safeguard outer space. It is obvious from what we have heard that even the regulatory frameworks that were developed are no longer relevant, given the pace of how things are moving. And still, for me, when you listen to all the news and everything in space, and you say, yeah, but how could it happen without the rules of the road? I mean, even traffic, you have to make sure on Earth, you have to make sure there's some rules of the road. But one gets the impression that what is happening is that there are no fixed rules of the road. And that is becoming extremely worrying. And then, again, when we think about what we're talking about now, what is happening now in the world, where there is non-respect for international law, are we to be worried that the question of weaponization of outer space is going to happen suddenly to surprise us? Because now we see international law being thrown out of the window. Is that a danger?
I see a question at the back there. Yeah, please.
Hi. Good afternoon. I'm Himanul. I'm a PhD candidate and teaching assistant right down the road over there in the Department of International Law. I have a question. It's not directed at one of the panelists specifically. I suppose anyone could take it up. I was wondering what your thoughts were with respect to the applicable use and bellow regulatory regime when we're talking about outer space warfare. What I have in mind specifically is recently we've had the Woomera manual come out. Maybe that's going to be the non-crystallization moment akin to the San Remo disease. What I was wondering about was if you read what the experts have talked about over there, their instinctive response seems to have been to reach for the law of land warfare. They're primarily looking at additional protocol 1, customary IHL norms. But my question is, do you think that given the inherently bilateralist logic and dyadic nature that land warfare has, is that the correct frame to be using when we're thinking about outer space warfare? When maybe, because it's a domain where third state rights and global commons concerns really need to be foregrounded. So I get the instinct to go to land warfare because it's very familiar, it's institutionalized, we know what we're talking about. But it only applies when there's landward effects. It has very little to say about indirect or reverberating effects. And for the future, if there's going to be outer space warfare, which has no terrestrial effects, it has absolutely no applicability. So should we be looking at frameworks beyond simply that of land warfare?
I'll just see if there's a no. Okay, Andreas, yeah.
I just want to quickly react to the answers to my question, because I have to challenge the assumption that just because law is not up to its times and that developments have changed the atmosphere does not mean that this law doesn't apply anymore. It still applies. And I am of the opinion that our Outer Space Treaty is an excellent document that actually looks forward into the different developments. Just because state behavior does not apply to the text anymore, or there is changed behavior, that just means that we have to step up our game as states and come to new norms and new conclusions. But just as a quick reminder, law is still valid. It is not dismantled. I mean, we are not talking about horses here, but we are talking about things that still are in use.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. I'm going to close the questions now because we only have 5 minutes left, and there were some very interesting points there. So let's go in reverse order this time.
Okay.
Yeah, Dimitri, please.
Yeah. Actually, it's one of the first times where I heard a good criticism of applying like traditional IHL to space, because generally speaking, a lot of people just say it's not applicable because it's not applicable. So this way makes much more sense. I think that the problem here has two parts. One is that actually, if there is a conflict, a military conflict in space, it has very specific projection on Earth's surface, including strikes against command centers and the communication nodes and so on. So here, something might be similar. But the broader issue is that from some perspectives, if we start this discussion, we already believe that, yes, eventually there will be war in space. And it looks like a lot of people are afraid of this thought for the good reasons. And I hope that we will never see it. But still, I think this is the problem. And then this debate is what precludes the proper discussion on how to apply rules of war to outer space. And another part related to what we've been discussing during this Q&A session is there are other things, and partly it was mentioned by Sergey, some things that can be replicated in space, although it will be harder. For example, notifications to airmen and to mariners, navigational warnings, something like that can be used in space. Of course, we won't speak about areas, we will speak about volumes, but so on. Again, if you're engaged in some activity that might become a problem, you can put out a notification. It's not something unknown. So yeah, this is what I wanted to say at the moment. So, thank you.
Thank you. So I think Thomas, you know.
I want to totally agree. I'm very thankful for the Outer Space Treaty. It both acknowledges the changing nature of space operations. So in Sergey's example, just mentioned again by Dimitri, notifications to airmen or telling civilian aircraft to move during a dangerous launch is absolutely not described in detail in the Outer Space Treaty, but it's absolutely captured in the notions of due regard. So I'm thankful that the Outer Space Treaty can be interpreted in these ways, and I can imagine it going further, not just notice to airmen on the ground, but in the future, notice to space operators, which I like to abbreviate as NOTSOs, of telling operators that you're going to perform a maneuver. I'm going to veer in this different direction. If you have activities in this orbital space, it's different kinematics in Earth orbit. If you're going to be in this orbital space, I want you to know you should vacate all civilian spacecraft. Sort of these paradigms can continue through time. So I'm thankful for that basis, but it's also clear as day to me that it doesn't govern all of the operations of spaceflight that we see today. That's just a fact. What's something that's a bit calming, though, about this fear of throwing away international space law, and I absolutely understand where that could come from. I would encourage folks in the audience who are curious about the development of counter space technologies to explore literature by me and my colleagues at the Secure World Foundation. Their Global Counter Space Capabilities Report is an annual one, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies Space Threat Assessment is an annual look at technologies being developed and tested in the public domain only, many of which by the way, are not physical, they're not kinetic, they don't create debris. Many of them are reversible. Some of them have challenges with attribution. This future of space warfare is poorly captured by images of satellites performing dogfights and shooting bullets at one another. But something that gives me peace, despite all those obvious examples of counter space development, is that clearly there are shared values in the space domain all the way across satellites' purposes. So military satellites and commercial satellites, it's obvious in their operations, share values like collision avoidance. No satellites want to collide with one another. And so we see different practices to live up to that value, different risk tolerances. Some satellite operators are very transparent about what their risk tolerances are, and others keep that close to the chest. But although we don't have rules of the road, there aren't lines drawn. If you think of that analogy for traffic, I grew up in a very rural area where there's a lot of dirt roads that have no lines in the traffic and in the road. But if there's two cars, if I'm driving a car and the other car is driving towards me, neither of us want to collide, and we will both take actions. They may be different from one another to avoid a collision. And so I think it's important as the environment gets more and more congested, when there's more and more of those two dark cars driving towards one another, to codify some of those norms. But I want people to realize that those operational norms are already alive and well, and they can be measured using tools from astrodynamics. I don't think we need like every diplomatic delegation to have an astrodynamicist, but it could be helpful to share some of these operational norms that are observable with Russian data, with US data, with commercial data. We can create robust descriptions of these behaviors that exemplify some of the values we can see in the domain.
Thank you, Thomas. So, did you want to
just quickly react to the question on international law. The Outer Space Treaty was agreed and concluded in the middle of Cold War, because the countries, the major spacefaring nations, they understood that we went too far, and there have been some reports that they have been, plans on putting nuclear weapons into orbit, and it could have led to something a real disaster. So the countries agreed. So my take on this, that we will be taking rapid and well thought and decisions to coordinate a lot of initiatives together when there will be an incident in space, unfortunately. And if there a huge collision between satellites, this will be a wake-up call. There have been collisions, but fortunately it didn't initiate a big international debate and norms for our operations.
Thank you. And Rashid, final word to you.
Okay. There's a lot of optimism on that side of the podium. I wish I had the same amount of optimism with me. I agree on the point that during the Cold War, the US and the USSR did come together. They decided that they went a bit too far, and it was in their interest to not go down that path of making space completely unusable, and the two sides decided to work together and bring about. But you had two major actors at that point of time. Today you have a multitude of actors, not just state actors. You have non-state, private entities, educational institutions, whole range of actors out there, non-state entities. How you bring about, and you have the geopolitical factors that just cannot be taken away. So how do you bring about an agreement involving all the major powers? Because even if you say every country is not a space launching power, and that you can just have a crack at developing rules of the road among the road, that's not going to happen. You need to bring about, because every single country is literally reliant on space, and they want to have a say in how space is going to be governed, how space is going to be used, and so on and so forth. So bringing about that kind of an agreement involving a large number of states and other parties is not going to be an easy task. And I think that's what we have been witnessing for the last 10 years in a sense. And Outer Space Treaty is absolutely relevant, and I have no doubts on that. But again, it has certain gaps and loopholes, and therefore the effort to create new rules of the road disagreement between TCBMs and legal measures. I am all for legal measures. That's an ideal goal. But in today's current political environment, I'm not hopeful that we are going to get there. In the meantime, space security threats are not stopping. And therefore, work with what is possible and feasible than work towards the ideal. And that's my general take on the governance measures. On whole range of other activities for on-orbit satellite servicing activities that are happening, technologies that are being developed to clean up the space debris and so on and so forth. How do you, because it's only a handful of states and entities who are developing these technologies, how do you decide who's going to remove a particular space debris piece? And the other increasing concern is that if you have developed a particular technology to remove a piece of debris, what is the guarantee that a particular entity is not going to use that technology to knock out another country's satellite? Because I think it's good. I don't want that particular country to have that imagery or a communication link in place. I can interfere with it. So how do you? And we haven't even started those conversations in real terms, in terms of sitting together, everybody deciding what are the norms, what are the basic principles that should be in place to have this kind of thing. Anyway, there's a lot that needs to happen. We don't have all the time today, but I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you for the great questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Raja. Yes, lots still to talk about. But, I think this topic is a fascinating one, and thank our panelists very much indeed for their perspectives. Thank you, Dimitri, Raji, Sergey, and Thomas. That was fantastic. I'd also like to thank the GCSP team, Florian, who you can't see behind the screen, making all the tech work, Vasiliki, our coordinator, and Carla on the questions. Thank you very much to you three for your support to this event. And finally, thank you to you, the audience, for being here. Audience in person, and also to all the people who were following online, and thank you for the online questions as well. I will leave you to go back out into the Geneva heat. Thanks for coming to our event at GCSP. Hope to see you again soon. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I like the clapping, by the way.